What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we are going to be concluding our pre-draft rankings before your 2024 redraft home leagues. Today, we're going to be talking about my top 40 wide receivers. So we've already done the quarterbacks, the tight ends, and the running backs. As I mentioned today, we're going through the wide receivers. So if you have not watched those other videos, I strongly suggest going to watch those at the end of today's video. If this is your first time here, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Pumping out a bunch of content trying to help you guys win your fantasy football leagues this year. But without wasting any more time, let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about these wide receivers. So as you guys can see, I have the tier maker pulled up on the screen as we speak. I mentioned we're going through the top 40 today. We will work our way from tier 1 all the way down to tier 8. And starting it off in my tier 1, I have two wide receivers. We're going to be talking about CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys and Tyreek of the Miami Dolphins. Now look, both of these players were dominant for fantasy football last year. Tyreek, he averaged 19.8 fantasy points per game. He was as good as it gets for fantasy football, an absolute game breaker. Obviously, he dealt with some injury down the stretch. I think this year it's pretty much the same thing, same scheme, same quarterback, same everything. Tyreek should be dominant, and CeeDee Lamb, again, a very dominant season for him. You look at how he was used down the stretch. Now the departure of Tony Pollard, no running back really in this backfield. It's going to be Rico Dowdle or Ezekiel Elliott, but we think Dak Prescott is going to continue feeding CeeDee Lamb. I think that's going to be the same thing that happens this year. I think these guys are top tier elite wide receiver ones for your fantasy football team. Now moving on to my tier 2, we still have elite wide receivers. I mean, those are not the only elite wide receivers, but we got Ja'Marr Chase, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Justin Jefferson. Now these kind of round out my top 5. Now the reason why I think that these players are not necessarily going to be in the tier 1 is just because last year's production and the outlook for 2024 isn't as clear as Lamb and Hill. Now, Ja'Marr Chase, obviously, we thought maybe T. Higgins would be leaving this roster. He didn't. He comes back on the franchise tag. Ja'Marr Chase, he's looking for a new contract. Some people are worried about it. I'm not too worried about it, but at the end of the day, he is going to be Joe Burrow's #1 target, still going to be elite for fantasy football. The same thing can be said for Amon-Ra St. Brown. Now, the target competition there is crowded. It didn't necessarily matter for Amon-Ra last year. He still was one of the most targeted wide receivers in football. He averaged 17 fantasy points per game. I think he's as safe as it comes for fantasy football wide receivers. He's going to give you an elite floor and an elite ceiling. So Amon-Ra still should be a top 5 pick. And Justin Jefferson, this is uncharted territory over the last couple of years for Justin Jefferson, only because we are usually talking about him as the wide receiver 1 for fantasy football. But this year, you know, there was a little bit of change at the quarterback position. Kirk Cousins goes to Atlanta. Now J.J. McCarthy, their first-round quarterback, goes down for the year. It's going to be Sam Darnold for the majority of the season. I think Justin Jefferson, you're still going to draft him as an elite asset, and I still think he's going to produce as an elite asset. But if you want to take those other 4 above him, that's what I'm doing. And I don't blame you if you want to do that as well. Now, moving on to my tier 3 here, I have 3 wide receivers in this tier as well. We're going to talk A.J. Brown, Garrett Wilson, and Puka Nacua of the Los Angeles Rams. These are still your elite wide receiver ones. I just don't know if they have the same ceiling as the guys above them. A.J. Brown, we've seen him be elite before, but last year, 13.9 fantasy points per game, that was a pretty significant step down from the guys like Amon-Ra and Justin Jefferson. Now, he still produced. He's still going to produce as the #1 wide receiver in this offense. You have Davante Smith there, Jalen Hurts still there, Saquon Barkley there, with Kellen Moore calling this offense, but at the end of the day, he just doesn't have the same ceiling as those guys, but I still think he's a top 6 wide receiver. Obviously, I'm still drafting him as such. Now, Garrett Wilson and Puka Nacua, I flip-flopped these two many times in my rankings. They are very close for me. If you want to take Puka over Garrett, I don't blame you. The only reason why I'm going to put Garrett Wilson over Puka Nacua in my rankings right now is because the target competition for Garrett Wilson is non-existent. There is nobody in New York right now that is going to compete for targets. Now, Puka, he does have Cooper Kupp. I think Cooper Kupp is going to be a fine wide receiver this year. But at the end of the day, Garrett Wilson has nobody there competing for targets. So with Aaron Rodgers healthy now, he should see a massive uptick in volume and in production from the last couple of seasons. And Puka, it goes without saying, put together the best rookie wide receiver season of all time. So I think this year with Kupp, Stafford, all of those guys healthy, this is going to be a very good Rams football team, and they're going to lean on Puka Nacua this season. Now, looking at tier 4, I have a massive tier of wide receivers here. It's going to get you from my wide receiver 9 all the way to my wide receiver 15, We're going to start with Marvin Harrison Jr., Drake London, Brandon Aiyuk, Nico Collins, Deebo Samuel, Chris Olave, and DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. So as I mentioned, this is a massive group of players. Now you can get most of these guys in the second round and in the third round of your drafts. That's kind of the big bunch that you're going to be picking them in. Marvin Harrison, people are going to say, hey, he is a rookie. He should not be in here as a top 10, let alone the 9th overall wide receiver in your rankings. At the end of the day, there are not very many rookie wide receivers that come in with the talent, with the pedigree, with the skill set that Marvin Harrison Jr. has. And oh, by the way, he's going into an amazing, fantastic opportunity with Kyler Murray, where he is going to be the #1 wide receiver in this offense and see a massive target share from day one. Now, people are also going to say, well, can't you say the same thing about Malik Neighbors? Can't you say the same thing about Rome Odunze? No, you can't. Rome Odunze, he has more target competition than any of these guys, and also Malik Neighbors does not have the quality of quarterback play that Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to have. So at the end of the day, as much as I like those other players and as much as I love them for Dynasty, in a redraft format, Marvin Harrison Jr. is tiers above those guys. Now, Drake London's one of my favorite breakout candidates in fantasy this year. We've talked about how Kirk Cousins likes to hyper-target the wide receiver one in his offenses. We've talked about how good Drake London is when he gets hyper-targeted. We have not seen this from him at the NFL level. He hasn't had the quarterback play to do it. When this does happen in 2024, you're going to have a massive ceiling for Drake London, and he's one of my favorite breakout candidates and a player that I am just very, very high on based on the opportunity that he has in front of him. Now, there's a grouping of players here as well that I feel like they all feel somewhat similar. They give you that very high ceiling, but there's some risk with them as well because there is going to be a little bit of competition. You have Brandon Aiyuk, Nico Collins, and Deebo Samuel. Now, we know how good the 49ers offense is. We know how good all of these players are here in San Francisco and how often they can cannibalize each other from week to week. Now, you are going to have some of the inconsistencies with your wide receivers in Deebo and in Brandon Aiyuk, but you are still going to have those boom weeks and those ceilings. I prefer Brandon Aiyuk over Deebo Samuel. At the end of the day, it's up to you to decide who you prefer, but they are in the same tier here, and these are guys that you can draft as a low-end wide receiver 1, maybe a high-end wide receiver 2 for your fantasy football team. And Nico Collins is kind of the same thing here. You have that target competition in Houston with Stefon Diggs and Tank Dell. I think this offense is going to be one of the best, if not the best, passing offense in the NFL this season. They're going to throw for a ton of touchdowns. CJ Stroud expected to take a big step forward in year 2. These are supposed to be Super Bowl contenders here in Houston. I think Nico Collins is the clear-cut wide receiver 1 in this offense to me, and somebody I'm very comfortable drafting as well. Now, I guess kind of in the same breath, you can also throw DJ Moore in here, but I am a little bit higher on DJ Moore than the community now. When you look at how Caleb Williams has performed in the preseason, when you look at how this offense is going to run, it does very much feel like they are going to continue to hyper-target DJ Moore. This is a guy who last season averaged 14 fantasy points per game. That would have put him in the top 12 as a finisher in fantasy football. I think DJ Moore has a similar season on tap. Now, you have a little bit more target competition than years past. I think that Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze are more likely to cannibalize each other than they are to cannibalize DJ Moore. But DJ Moore, clear-cut wide receiver 1 here in Chicago for me. I think he's still going to have a very fantastic season. And Chris Olave, this is kind of the elephant in the room. The way that I am projecting Chris Olave is I'm finally expecting him to take that step forward. At the end of the day, we haven't seen Olave really produce as a wide receiver 1. Now, where I have him in my rankings, I have him as my wide receiver 14, so this is a high-end wide receiver 2. He averaged 11.7 fantasy points per game, but at the end of the day, the draft cost that you have to use to grab Chris Olave on your rosters is not great. I have him in a tier here where you're able to get Deebo Samuel in the 3rd, Nico in the 3rd, Aiyuk in the 3rd, DJ Moore in the 4th round, and Chris Olave has a 2nd round ADP. It's the same type of ADP as Marvin Harrison and Drake London. I think because of that, he is a player that I'm not going to be drafting a lot of this year. I haven't drafted a lot of him this year, and I probably am not going to suggest that you guys draft a lot of Chris Olave either. Now, at the end of the day, if you can get him in a tier here where these guys are in the same bunch and you want to take the swing on Chris Olave, that's fine, but his draft cost is much more expensive than most of the guys in this tier, so you will find better values later in your drafts in a similar type of talent tier. Now, moving on to my tier 5 here, I have 7 wide receivers in this tier as well, going from wide receiver 16 all the way to wide receiver 22. I do want to kick off this tier with Davante Adams, followed by Mike Evans, Jaylen Waddle, Michael Pittman Jr., DK Metcalf, Stefon Diggs, and Cooper Kupp of the Los Angeles Rams. Now, there's some players in this tier that if we were drafting 2 years ago, 3 years ago, you would say, Andrew, why are these players so low. Davante Adams, Mike Evans, Stefon Diggs, Cooper Kupp, some of the older guys in the NFL, but they are still going to be producers for fantasy football, but they just might not finish as top 10 guys. Davante Adams, Mike Evans, Stefon Diggs, Cooper Kupp, these are older wide receivers, man. Time always comes and takes those elite wide receivers from us, and it's not like these guys are going to be irrelevant for fantasy football. I mean, I have all of these guys as wide receiver 2s or better. I mean, you just got guys that I think are going to take that step back. We've seen them kind of lose a step already, and you have guys that are going to be good in their offense as well, especially when you talk about Stefon Diggs and Cooper Kupp. You know, you got Puka Nacua and Nico Collins. But at the end of the day, the efficiencies, they've come down. These are not necessarily good offenses, especially in Las Vegas and maybe even in Tampa as well with the departure of Dave Canales. These are players that I think you should be drafting as wide receiver 2s, not as your wide receiver 1s. Now, Jaylen, Waddle, Michael Pittman, and DK Metcalf, these are younger guys that also have the upside. The problem is we also know that those offenses are maybe not the best passing offenses, especially when we're talking about Indianapolis and Seattle. And Jaylen Waddle, we just know that Tyreek Hill is going to be there to cannibalize most of the number 1 wide receiver targets. I think Jaylen Waddle is still going to have good upside for you, and I think the same thing with DK and Michael Pittman. The thing is, they're just capped as wide receiver 2s, low-end wide receiver 1s on some good weeks. Now, moving on to my tier 6, I have 8 players in this tier. We'll start off with Malik Neighbors, followed by Devontae Smith, T. Higgins, George Pickens, Amari Cooper, Rashee Rice, Tank Dell, and Zay Flowers to finish off the tier. Now, I think this tier has some chance for some breakout candidates, maybe some boom players in this type of tier, especially when we're talking about Malik Neighbors, Devontae Smith, T. Higgins, George Pickens, Rashee Rice, maybe even Tank Dell. Tank Dell has a little bit more competition than almost all of these guys. But at the end of the day, this is a tier where I'm very comfortable swinging with these guys as high upside wide receiver 3s on my fantasy football team. I think Neighbors, as I mentioned earlier, he is an elite talent, and I love Malik Neighbors as a player. The situation is going to be rough to start his career. Daniel Jones in the preseason hasn't looked good. He's probably not going to be that great in the regular season as well. He should have a massive target share. The quality of those targets is going to be rough, I think, as well. Think similar to Garrett Wilson, Drake London over their first couple of seasons when they were getting footballs thrown to them by Zach Wilson and Desmond Ridder. Good players, not a lot of good opportunity their way. So I think Malik Neighbors, we need to kind of cap the excitement. The excitement's been really out of control for a guy like Malik Neighbors. There's some people that think he's going to be a top 10, top 12 guy this year. I just don't see that being a very realistic pathway for Malik Neighbors. So as much as I like him, I do think we need to pump the brakes. Now, Devontae Smith, T. Higgins, these are some of the elite wide receiver 2s in fantasy football. They don't have very high upside because of the guys ahead of them in Jamar Chase and A.J. Brown, but the offenses are very good. They're going to be high passing volume offenses, and the quality of targets is going to be very good from the quarterbacks that they have in front of them. I think these guys are going to be very safe wide receiver 3s, and they have some spike week upside in the offenses that they're in. Now, George Pickens is interesting. He's one of the best breakout candidates, I think, this year as well, because the opportunity in front of him is massive. Right now, George Pickens is the wide receiver 1 of the Pittsburgh Steelers. There have been rumors about them wanting to get another wide receiver in here, but it doesn't really look like that is something that is likely going to happen at the time of this recording. Now, George Pickens, again, we'll talking about quality of targets like Malik Neighbors. Maybe Justin Fields, maybe Russell Wilson don't give you the best quality of targets, but they're going to be better than Daniel Jones. And you have the offense that is going to be improved, I think, this year with a new play caller in Arthur Smith and not the play caller in Matt Canada. Now, if you told me at the end of the year that George Pickens outperformed his wide receiver ranking that I have him as right now as the wide receiver 26, I would not be surprised. But this is a guy that does have some risks still, just based on the uncertainty at the quarterback position and the unknowns of this offense. Amari Cooper, it goes without saying, he's old, reliable, 12.7 fantasy points per game last year. Deshaun Watson back under center. Kind of expect same and similar results from Amari Cooper here in 2024. There's not too much really that we need to add to that. Rashee Rice, I think he is a very solid candidate in your drafts that you can be drafting at a discount. Some of your league mates are still going to be worried about a suspension. It does not seem like that is coming. Rashee Rice, he should be the number 1 option for Patrick Mahomes in this offense right away. He has the rapport from last year. Now, there's still going to be guys like Xavier Worthy and Hollywood Brown that come in, especially after Hollywood recovers from his injury. But at the end of the day, Rashee Rice, he has the rapport with Patrick Mahomes. He should be the number 1 wide receiver here behind Travis Kelce. And then Tank Dell and Zay Flowers. I like both of these players. Dell, we're kind of bumping him down our rankings because we expect Nico Collins and Stefon Diggs to work ahead of him in the pecking order. And Zay Flowers, he is one of the wide receivers that I am a little bit nervous about going into year 2. I think he's a very talented player. The opportunity that he's in is unique. Lamar Jackson, he's not necessarily a high volume thrower. And last year when Mark Andrews was off the field, that was when the best of Zay Flowers' production was on the table. When Mark Andrews was on the field, Zay Flowers really wasn't producing the way we wanted him to for our fantasy football rosters. So I want to see him produce with Andrews on the field, but the addition of Derrick Henry makes me nervous about Zay Flowers this year because it means that they might just run the football even more than they have in years past. Now, tier 7 is going to have 6 wide receivers in it. We're going to talk about Terry McLaurin, Deontay Johnson, Jayden Reed, Calvin Ridley, Christian Kirk, and Christian Watson. Now, I think that these players all kind of have similar type of ceilings. Terry McLaurin, Deontay Johnson, Calvin Ridley, and Christian Kirk should all be the #1 receiving options in their offenses, but I don't really feel like these guys really have that much upside either. McLaurin, he's going to have the new quarterback in Jaden Daniels throwing him the football, and I think Jaden Daniels is going to be good for fantasy football. How much he's going to throw, still to be seen. Cliff Kingsbury's air raid offense is going to be the new offense here in Washington as well. If we are going to see the breakout from Terry McLaurin ever, it's going to have to be this year with Jaden Daniels under center. Deontay Johnson, he gets to be the alpha in a Dave Canales offense with Bryce Young throwing him the football, but how high scoring is this offense going to be? I think that's still to be seen. Same thing can be said with Calvin Ridley, the #1 here in Tennessee with Will Levis throwing him the football. And Christian Kirk, I like Christian Kirk a lot, but the reality is that there's a lot of other mouths to feed in this offense as well. Now, when it comes to the Green Bay Packers wide receivers, I prefer Jayden Reed over Christian Watson just by a little bit, but I have them in the same tier. I think when you look at the ADPs, Christian Watson is going in round 8, Jayden Reed is going in round 7, so if you just want to wait and get Christian Watson around later, I don't blame you. As I mentioned, they're the same tier for me. But at the end of the day, this is going to be a good offense. I expect these to be the top 2 wide receivers in this offense, and this should have a lot of scoring opportunities here in Green Bay. And now moving on to my last and final tier, tier 8. This will give us the last 4 wide receivers to round out my top 40. I have Rome Odunze of the Chicago Bears, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Keenan Allen, and Brian Thomas Jr. Now here's the thing. All of these players are super talented. The reality is that there's some murkiness in front of them. I think Rome Odunze, when we talk about talents, he is as talented as pretty much any wide receiver in football. I just think that Rome Odunze has a very tough pathway to targets this year. And the reality is Keenan Allen is in this tier because of the same situation. I think when you look at this Bears offense, Rome Odunze and Keenan Allen, they're going to cannibalize each other. I kind of already mentioned that with the DJ Moore, but because of that, it's also going to cap the upside of these guys. I think long term, you're going to want Rome Odunze. The second half of the year, you're going to want Rome Odunze. Maybe the first half of the year, you want Keenan Allen. But there's also been some pretty negative talk about Keenan Allen right now in preseason. And then Jackson Smith and Jigba and Brian Thomas Jr. are 2 of my favorite breakouts. If you want to throw some darts on these guys later in drafts, you can get JSN in round 8. You can get Brian Thomas Jr. all the way in round 10. I think these guys are going to take steps forward. Obviously, Brian Thomas Jr. being a rookie, so taking a step forward is kind of just welcoming you into the NFL, I guess. But Brian should be the #1 wide receiver for Trevor Lawrence, the X, the big play wide receiver. He is going to unlock a lot in this offense. I have high hopes for Brian Thomas this year. And then JSN in year 2, Ryan Grubb offense. We expect him to overtake Tyler Lockett and become a fantasy football contributor. So there you guys have it. That is my top 40 wide receivers for fantasy football. As you can see, working our way from wide receiver 1 all the way to wide receiver 40. If you guys did enjoy this video, go ahead and hit the like button. As I mentioned, we also did the running backs, the quarterbacks, and the tight ends versions of these videos. So go check those out on the channel. While you're there, make sure you hit the subscribe button as well. We got a goal of 3,000 subscribers by week 1. I think we can do it if you guys all go hit that subscribe button for me. And last but not least, go join the Discord. I have a free Discord linked in the description. I'm helping you guys with your fantasy drafts, trades, waivers, all of that stuff for fantasy football, helping you guys. We've got an awesome community there. I strongly suggest you join it. And as I mentioned, it's free to join, so there is no risk in doing that. Now, with all of that being said, I have nothing else for you guys today, so I will see you on our next video. But until then, peace out.